Everyone, thanks for coming out. I'm Kyle Cleveland with TUJ's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. This topic is obviously quite timely given events of this last year. At this university, I'm the study abroad advisor and was dealing with our crisis management. And I think every organization, every embassy in Japan had very similar kinds of experiences of not being as prepared as they wish they might have been and trying to learn lessons from what we all experienced. I think we're fortunate this evening to have Leo Bosner, who has considerable experience working some 28 years for the federal government in their Office of Federal Emergency Management, dealing with all sorts of crises. He dealt with the Oklahoma City bombing. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, he was dealing with that as well. More recently, Katrina. And so this is a person who has, I think, really genuine experience in major wide-scale disasters. And so to be able to make some comparisons between the way the United States has dealt with these issues and Japan will be interesting. Also, Leo, going back to 1996, following the Kobe quake, had been consulted and has made a number of trips to Japan, and for the last several weeks has been going around Japan talking to various people. So he also has, I think, an up-to-date understanding of how the Japanese government did or didn't deal with these issues. We'll go for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have an extended Q&A, so I think we'll have a good discussion. I'd like to welcome Leo Bosner.
Emergency management, we're always ready. Well, thank you all, Konbanwa. Thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you for the introduction there. Yeah, ever since last year's disaster, I happened to be over here lecturing at that time as well, though I was not in Tohoku at the time. People are very concerned about disaster management. Can we do better? Do we do a good job, etc.? Let me start off by saying I think that the people who went up and worked in Tohoku, the people from the self-defense force, the municipalities, the volunteers, the doctors, nurses, they just did a fantastic job under incredibly adverse conditions, and I really praise them a lot. I think they did a wonderful job. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is the planning aspect, sort of what you could do ahead of time to plan. Last year I was actually scheduled to talk on March 11th at a cabinet office, but I had laryngitis from too many lectures and couldn't. And afterwards people said, well, you know, what could you have told them the morning of March 11th? And I was telling Kyle, I could say, well, hop in your time machine and go back 2 years and start doing some planning. Because it takes time to put these things together. It's not something that can be done really quickly and overnight. Anyway, tonight I'm going to talk briefly about planning for the local level disaster response, because since the local people are the ones that respond, their planning is really essential. A lot of these principles can apply as well to national planning. I'll also mention this is like a 30 or 40-minute lecture. Normally, this would be like a 1-week course or a 2 weeks course. I'm just scanning over this stuff very briefly, but there is internet information if those people are interested later. Now, basically, the thing is, first responders to a disaster are the local people. The local fire and rescue people, the local hospitals, the local volunteers and citizens. It's not the government. The government does the best they can, but it takes them a while to really get organized, so the local people are responding first. And you say, well, what if the local people are overwhelmed? Well, the point is that even if a community has had a horrendous disaster, I feel there are still 5 main things that a community can still do. They can assess their damages, like what's been hit and what hasn't. They can really determine what's needed the most. They can use the resources, whatever they have, as efficiently and as effectively as possible. They can request aid in a very efficient way from their state or prefectural level or from the national government, and they can also coordinate with outside groups who will be coming in to help. And in today's lecture, I'm talking about really 4 points here, and there'll be lots of little numbers and subsets we go through it. I'll be talking about the essential concept of a plan, a typical U.S. local level plan, how to write the local plan, how to test it. Now, all hazards planning sounds good. What exactly is the deal with all hazards planning? Well, we feel that a community can have almost any kind of disaster. Now, there's going to be 1 or 2, maybe a few major hazards they face. There's going to be a flood risk, they're in a tsunami zone, they're over an earthquake fault, something like this. Yeah, those are big things to worry about. But there's also the major plane crash, the train wreck, the terrorist bombing, the sarin gas attack, who knows what. So with all these different hazards around, the question gets to be, if there's 100 hazards out there, you need a big bookshelf with 100 different disaster plans. Maybe you'll alphabetize them or something. And that's really not a good way to go. We used to do that in the States about 30 years ago. It's not effective to have all these different plans. The all-hazard planning, what we say is that the root of this is the cause of the disaster is not as important as the mechanics of the disaster response. And little things like this actually become pretty significant. So we say, for example, some people like to say, well, here's the earthquake plan, here's the terrorist plan, here's this. We say, no, no, no. If a building collapses and people are trapped under a concrete building, you want to try to get them out. What do you need? You need, okay, search and rescue with specialized tools and training. You need medical teams to treat them. You need hospital preparedness. And then to say, why did the building collapse? Was it from an earthquake or a terrorist bomb? Was it an accidental gas explosion of some type? From the point of view of the rescue operation, that doesn't matter. You send in the teams, they do the work. So we at FEMA, where I retired from there 4 years ago. I should mention nothing here is official U.S. government. This is my own opinion, so I always get that in. We established search and rescue teams back in the 80s, and our thoughts really were about earthquakes, but the plan was search and rescue teams. And in 1994, I think it was, at the Northridge earthquake in California, we used the teams to go in and try to rescue people. And it was a year later, Oklahoma City, 95, the terrorist bombing. Same teams, same search and rescue techniques, went in to rescue people. So the advice I'm trying to give to Japan government type people and others is, if you're going to make some plans, this always shakes them up. I say, don't make a tsunami plan. Don't make an earthquake plan. Make a disaster response plan, first of all, and then within that, fit in these different special considerations for earthquakes and everything else. Now, and pardon me if I get confused, I'm glancing at notes here that are written in Romanji for the Japanese language lectures I've been doing. I'm translating back into my brain into English, so, oh well, as a Toshiori, I'll do my best. So let's talk about the typical format for one of these plans. Okay, you've got four main parts to a plan. These plans can be pretty huge. Sacramento, California, I think, is a couple of hundred pages long. You've got the basic plan, the functional chapters, the hazard-specific chapters, and the standard operating procedures. Going through these kind of one by one, and I apologize, note the stuff's mainly in kanji and Japanese here, but you can also read the English at the bottom there. The basic plan is really the summary. The overall summary for this particular jurisdiction. What kind of a disaster planning office do they have? How is it staffed? What's their table of organization? What's their organization chart? What kind of hazards do they face in this particular community? How is the plan activated and how is it managed? This is really the basic outline. Then when you get into the functional chapters, these are the specific functions that need to be carried out. I don't know if I have this in English or not. No, I don't. That need to be carried out in a disaster. And again, this is one of these ideas that sounds simple, but it's really crucial, and it took us years to figure this out. We don't start off, in our planning at FEMA, we don't start off by saying, have the health department do this, have the fire department do this, have your agency do this, have your... We don't do agencies. We do functions, which are jobs. What kinds of things might need to be done after the disaster? Well, you're going to need some kind of medical response. You might need emergency water, emergency food, search and rescue, electrical power. The things you might need to do. You first make that list out. Then after you've got your things figured out, and again, this is in kanji, you start assigning it out to the different agencies. Okay, health and medical planning, that goes to the health ministry or the health department. Search and rescue, probably to the fire department, etc. You assign these things out by function to the different agencies, and then those agencies make their own specific plans for those different types of disasters they'll go to. And at this point, they can start looking at the specific difficulties, the specific problems of, can't read my kanji, the specific problems of the disaster within their specialty. So, for example, doctors, medical people can tell you in a heartbeat that there are big differences between medical response to a tsunami and medical response to an earthquake. Okay, this is where that part goes. This is where we start getting hazard specific. But we get hazard specific for that specialty, for search and rescue, or for medical, allowing the doctors, allowing the specialists to work within their field. And there's one added advantage here, and pardon me, I'm jumping around a little bit, it's kanji illiterate here. If you have, doing it the old way, where you say people make up an earthquake plan, if you tell a bunch of doctors at a hospital, okay, you've got to make an earthquake plan. If they have to make the whole earthquake plan, they're also planning on how to pack boxes and how to order up helicopters and how to get buses and tents and hotels and things like that. And we think, no, that's really dumb. These people went to medical school not to learn how to pack boxes or how to charter airplanes. They went to medical school to learn how to treat victims of an accident of some type. If they need transportation, have them contact FEMA or whichever group is in charge here and say, okay, we need transportation for 50 doctors, 30 nurses, and 20 cases of medical supplies to go from here to here. Okay, fine. FEMA will then turn to, or whichever local emergency management agency, will turn to their transportation specialists and say, please arrange transportation for 50 docs, 20 nurses, and X many cases of medical supplies. So the docs and people can concentrate on medical things. The search and rescue people concentrate on search and rescue things. It's not a perfect system, but that's the way we've gone for about the last 20 or 25 years in the States, and there's a big improvement over our old system. The third part, we get into the specific hazards within a jurisdiction, where we talk about what are the hazards that exist here. This is where you'll find the flood hazard map. This is where you'll find the different flood levels and where you'll find the earthquake faults. You list these things out in the hazard-specific chapter. And this gets into detail. What are the evacuation routes? If you're in Florida and there's a hurricane zone here, what are the evacuation routes to get out? Where are the shelters likely to be? Things like that. Click, click, click. And then the SOPs, and I always get lots of questions about this. SOPs, standard operating procedures, are sort of, now they're getting down to the real nuts and bolts that you can give to a person and say, here, okay, if you're going to use this classroom here at Temple University for a lecture, when you're done, number 1, please turn all machines off. Number 2, turn off the air conditioning. Number 3, make sure the windows are locked. Number 4, lock the door on your way up and turn the lights off. There's the SOPs for this room. When I was a FEMA employee, my SOPs would fit inside my wallet. You know, here's the number to call in case of emergency. If that number doesn't work, here's the next number. If that doesn't, grab a water bottle and a sandwich and, hike down to the building and find what's going on. The SOPs are very straightforward, so people know exactly what they're supposed to do. Now, how to make the plan. And here's a problem we run into. And I was saying to Kyle Cleveland, I think earlier, the only reason I can expound so much about any mistakes I see in Japan is we made these mistakes 10 times over back in the U.S. So I'm speaking from experience, believe me. If, in creating the plan, if we hand this off to somebody who's the top person or hand it off to a contracting company and they go away and close the doors and write the plan, it's not going to be a very good plan, which is one of the things that happened to us in Hurricane Katrina. Making the plan is a team effort. Everybody who's involved has to get into this thing. If there's going to be medical people involved, if the police department is going to be setting up roadblocks, if the fire department is going to be doing things, they all have to be involved, because that's how you're going to find the problems that might exist, and you're going to head these problems off ahead of time. That's where, if the police department is sitting over here saying, don't worry, we'll set up roadblocks to keep out the looters or the crazies, and the medical people are sitting over here saying, oh, don't worry, we'll call this company to bring in more medical supplies in their truck. Well, these two people better talk to each other ahead of time to make sure the police know which truck to let through, or otherwise, this happened once in Louisiana, they won't let the medical supply truck through. So who sits on this committee? Boy, oh boy, oh boy. It's a long list. And this is why you get down to these things. We say, putting together a good plan like this, if you're starting sort of from scratch, it's not going to happen in 90 days. It's going to happen maybe, a year maybe. It took us a while at FEMA. Not because we're all sitting around drinking coffee, but because these people have to sit and talk and talk and discuss and discuss. And if somebody says, well, okay, I need your agency to do such and such, fine. You can't just say yes. You've got to go back to your agency, talk to your boss, budget the thing out, look at your legal authorities, talk to your legal office and say, are you allowed to do that? What kind of staff would you have to hire? What kind of training would they need? This is a very long, drawn-out process. This process has been skipped sometimes. Back at FEMA back in the 1980s, when it was sort of a pretend agency, as it became under Bush again, we had this great plan. But when the disaster, Hurricane Andrew, actually hit, well, all those people said, well, my office will do this. It's like, oh, we haven't actually hired the staff yet to do that. Well, hey, guy, the hurricane was last night. You have to do this planning ahead of time. It's a long process, but it needs to be done, and all of these people need to be involved. Putting the plan together now, and I know I'm kind of going through this quickly, but as I said, this would be a 1 or 2 week course probably. 4 main steps is the hazard research, the plan development, the testing and validation, and the plan maintenance. Hazard research is no big mystery. This is where you map out the floodplains. This is where you have the earthquake faults and those things. You have to have this very specific. This is very, very specific to the community. This is why you start getting these very thick plans. Not that you're supposed to whip through it and look through it during the disaster, but this plan contains your flood maps, your earthquake maps, etc. After you do that, you develop the plan. And again, this is getting down to why it's a many weeks and many month-long process where all these team members get together, they have subcommittees and subgroups, they work and work and talk and talk and talk. They finally get the final plan out. But as I say here with my little question, but is it really the final plan? When any bureaucrat asks you, oh no, it's not, it can't be. Now we have to test the plan. What kind of problems exist in the plan? If some office says they're going to do something, do they have the staff to do that? Have these staff been trained? I spent a few weeks ago, I spent about 2 weeks up in Tohoku, and one of the things I was told repeatedly was, the government people, the prefectural government, the national government people, they were doing their best. They were working hard. But a lot of them had never really been trained for these duties they were supposed to do. So some guy in the prefecture is supposed to be managing an incident command system. And he might have a big thick book here. He can look up incident command under I or something like that. But he's never actually done it. He's never been trained for it. And so even though it says this in the plan, he can't do it. Or if some agency gets out there and the food's supposed to be distributed and they say, well, wait a minute. We don't know if we have legal authority because that truck didn't come from the government, it came from a private company. We're not sure we're authorized to unload that truck or not. So you got a truck full of food over here and you got 100 people over here, and people are mumbling back and forth, are we authorized to do this or not? These are all problems that have to be sorted out ahead of time because during the disaster it takes a whole lot longer, as we saw in Tohoku. Process takes a long time. Why? Well, first of all, as I said, there's lots and lots of meetings to go on. Second thing that happens is there are people who don't really want to learn about the problems inside the plan. If you learn about problems, that means you got to fix the problems, and those things cost money. And the politicians don't like to spend money. At FEMA, back in 2004, a whole year before Hurricane Katrina, they did this huge simulation called Hurricane Pam with FEMA, Louisiana State, and New Orleans City, people sitting down. They found all kinds of problems in the plan. They said, well, we're going to evacuate people out of New Orleans, but a lot of people in New Orleans don't own cars. They don't have trains here like in Japan. Well, you need buses, you need something to get those people out. These little old people can't just walk, 80 miles here or whatever. Great, but nobody ever followed through. Nobody ever said, okay, let's go find out, contract with a bus company to have buses available. That takes money to do that. The government doesn't want to spend money, so things don't get done. On the other side of the coin, what happens is the government says, we need this right away. Back in 2003, after all the 9/11 stuff, the Homeland Security Department wanted to create a new national response plan. The first plan took a couple of years to put together. They want the new one in 90 days. Now, I said, why would 89 or 91 not have worked? But 90 days was the deal. And it was impossible. If they took it away from FEMA and they gave it to a private company, gave them a whole lot of money, and they made their deadline, got the plan in 90 days, and that was the plan that did not work during Hurricane Katrina. What I've heard here in Japan is the government has said we need a good tsunami plan or a good something or other by March 11th, 2012. Well, they might have something by then, but if it's not a good plan, it's not going to be a plan that works. So finally, you have to maintain the plan. And this is something we build into our process at FEMA because every disaster, you got a great plan, but there's things that go wrong. There's things that don't work. You can't just gloss it over and say, well, let's all set our alarms earlier and get up the next time and work harder. No, if there was a problem there, let's pull a committee together, get a group together, a working group, and fix that problem. And we had very specific processes for that in the federal response plan. And when the fix was made, we would publish new pages and send them out to people and say, please rip out the old page and put this one in. Here's the new part of this plan that has to be done. Okay, then how to test it. And this is where we kind of get into the exercise business. Here in Japan, more so than the US, they do all kinds of these great outdoor exercises, these big drills, the Bosai Kunran and those things. Those are great, except most of the problems we've run into in disasters don't involve skills. They don't involve the skills of the people. These outdoor exercises test people's skills, and that's good. It's good to keep those skills up to date. But by and large, firefighters know how to do firefighting, and cops know how to do cop stuff, and doctors know how to fix people that have been hurt. The problems we ran into in Hurricane Katrina again and again and again was the plan itself. The lack of coordination, the lack of a management system among these different groups. These are the problems we ran into. And so one of the things that we've really recommended is that people do simulation exercises. In addition to doing these big outdoor drills, do some real simulation exercises where you ask some tough questions. And I'm getting ahead of myself there. Where you ask some of these tough questions. Because if you don't do that, you're going to run into problems. But first, let me get to this. I have talked to a number of people, and this slide is already outdated. I'll put the kanji up first here for a second for the benefit of the Japanese guest present, then there's English coming up next. The kind of problems that I was told about even before coming here, just by emailing and stuff, before I came here on my current fellowship, the problems at the disaster response, things that were their problems, continuity of local government, how to do a damage assessment, the communication with the different levels of government, requesting aid, interagency coordination, communication with their own local residents. In some cases, the local people didn't even know what was going on. The coordinating with outside groups, the use of volunteers and NGOs and non-government, nonprofit organizations who could have played a crucial role here and oftentimes were kept out. Donations management, the same thing. And I always say, you look at this list, and these are the things that keep getting repeated over and over to me. Nothing on this list is a skill problem. Nobody on the list said, the doctors didn't know how to fix wounds or the firefighters didn't know how to put out fires. No, the problems have always been the management, the coordination of this thing. This is where the problems really exist. So we really recommend that people do both kinds of these exercises. And the story I always tell is about 10, 11 years ago when I was here on a previous visit in Japan. I went to I was interviewing people and stuff. I went to a Japanese hospital, and they had just recently done a big outdoor disaster drill. Big thing, the fake patients, the fake blood, the firefighters, the sandwiches, all this stuff. Great, that's really great. I'm glad they do that. I'm not knocking it. But, there's always a little but here. I said to them, okay, I'm curious now. You've got an emergency generator in your hospital, right? How much fuel do you have for that? 24 hours worth. Okay, if there's a major disaster, after 24 hours, the electric's gone, and now you're using up your fuel, where are you going to get more diesel after 24 hours? And nobody had any idea. Well, I'm not faulting these people, but the fact is you can have the best doctors and surgeons and nurses in the world, but if your electric's gone and you haven't got any system in place to get more diesel fuel in there, you haven't got any electricity, it's not going to be much of a hospital. So when people talk about the plan and exercising and testing it, that's the kind of questions you get into. What if this and what if that? That don't show up in the Bosai Kunran. They can show up in simulations. So we recommend both very much. Now, how to do these things, there are a few resources online. A number of them actually. There's an IS-139 exercise design. These are all on the FEMA website. It's just FEMA.gov. You can scroll through and find all kinds of stuff. In fact, there's about 125 online courses that FEMA has for disaster management. For local officials, for veterinarians, for nonprofit organizations, for local emergency managers. About 125, as best I can figure out in Japan. I think they've got 2. And one of them is, I think, like a 1-hour seminar or something, which is one of the lacks that I see here. There's also, for medical people, there's a particularly good item here, strategies for incident preparedness. That's available online. If anybody's interested, I've also got a more updated version on my USB. I'd be glad to share with you. Also, other stuff that's online. This lecture here, my little 30-minute lecture or so, came out of a 300-page guidebook. And again, I don't want to measure guidebooks by weight and say, gee, it's 300 pages, it must be really good. The point is, This is not something that people should look at and say, quick, there's a disaster, let me pull down and start flipping through it and find out what to do. This is more like a college textbook or something that says, okay, you study this and you learn your particular part. And maybe you learn the parts of the people next to you on either side and the parts of the people above you and below you. So you learn how to do this. But anyway, we put together, and I was involved in that project, I'm pretty happy to say, we put together a fairly detailed guidebook from FEMA instructing states and localities on how they should go about writing a disaster plan. It wasn't a regulation, it wasn't a rule or a requirement, it was just a free guidebook. And those things got snapped up pretty well because we'd written this guidebook in conjunction with a lot of states and localities and professional associations. And we offered it for free because one of the things I was saying before, FEMA gives out lots of free training, free guidebooks to the localities and the states, not because we're these angelic people, but because we know that if a big disaster takes place, it's going to be a lot easier for us if the municipality and if the state already knows what they're supposed to do, and if they know our system and we know their system, we can work together pretty well. Otherwise, it's going to be cacophony. Now, briefly here, I want to touch on a couple of additional points. I've been asked by a couple of people, okay, looking at last year's disaster and blah, 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 how can you compare the U.S. and Japan? And this gets kind of tricky to try to put into a very short lecture. But in terms of disaster management or emergency management, what we'd say at FEMA, humans like to put things in little categories. Generally speaking, you can say there's 4 phases to emergency management. Number 1, mitigation or prevention. That's when you try to stop the bad things from happening at all. That's the earthquake-resistant building construction. So if a quake happens, people don't get killed. That's the levees to hold the floodwaters back, or the seawalls to hold the tsunami back. Prevention. The second thing you do is preparedness. If the disaster does take place, how are you ready to get out there and go to work? This is where you get into the training, the drills, the exercises, the public education, all those things. Third phase is the response itself, getting people out the door, getting them out there to rescue the survivors and get people into shelters and so on. Then fourth is the recovery phase, which is months or maybe years, trying to rebuild the communities and the cities, rebuild people's lives. And if I look at these different things, number 1, the mitigation or prevention. I'm not an engineer, but I just from my observations, I feel that Japan is extremely strong in this area. Probably anger my American friends, probably much stronger than the U.S. I think the construction standards here are great. I think they're trying to make them even better. I think Japan's to be really congratulated on that. Skipping down to number 4, long-term recovery. I think that both the U.S. and Japan have tough problems to try to handle there. It's not easy to just say, well, you've got all these people from Tohoku who have been displaced at various ages and employments and education levels. Here, put their lives back together. It's not easy. Japan is wrestling with this problem now. In the U.S., we have and are still wrestling with it for the Hurricane Katrina victims. So those are tough in both countries. Preparedness, number 2, I think Japan has some very strong points. The outdoor drills that both side runs, those are good things. I wish we did more of them in the States. It's hard to get that kind of thing really, really up and running. They do good drills, and they do a lot of good community preparedness here. I think much more than we do in the U.S. I think that part's good. Where Japan falls short, in my view, in preparedness is to start off with, the lack of simulation exercises to actually look at the plans hard and run through scenarios and see try to learn ahead of time where they're going to run into problems. In an outdoor drill, you're trying to do everything right. In a simulation exercise, you're trying to dig up the things that might go wrong. They don't do enough. They're starting to do more of that in Japan, but aren't doing it enough, I don't think. In addition to that, maybe linked to that, a lot of the plans here are just not realistic. They just haven't really been worked through. Just to give an example, you might have an office in a prefecture, and you say, okay, if there's a disaster, people are going to call this number, and the guy will answer and get some help for him. Well, yeah, but if you got one guy and one telephone, and what if you have 100 villages out there and they're all trying to call you at the same time? It's happened, of course. They can't get through, and one person can't handle that. Now, at FEMA, we did think about stuff like that ahead of time. We have what's called surge capacity. So normally, day-to-day, yeah, one guy and one phone. But if a big disaster occurs, we'll have a contract in place that more phones are coming in like today, and more people are going to be called in from reserve duty or whatever to staff those phones today. And they don't do a lot of that in Japan. They kind of have, I don't want to pick on my Japanese friends, but they more have a strict idea, well, here, this person will do that. That's his job to do that. Well, you can say it's his job to do it, but one person trying to answer 1,000 phone calls ain't going to work. So on the preparedness side, kind of so-so. On the response side, what FEMA's done, and FEMA's had its ups and downs. Under both Papa Bush and under, I call him Mini Bush, we had a lot of problems and not very good planning, not very good administration. Hurricane Katrina was certainly evidence of that. But at least FEMA is there, and it's an agency that can be fixed if it goes wrong, and it's getting fixed again, I think. FEMA's big job has been coordination. I think that's one of the main things we do on the response side. We don't have helicopters or doctors at FEMA. We don't have airplanes at FEMA. We have the authority to pull people together and the plans to get people together and say, you put your doctors on that guy's airplane and this guy will arrange hotels for you to get there. This is mostly what FEMA does. And because of that, and because over the years, because of the state and local training we've done, little by little, the local communities and the states have gradually kind of centered into almost identical types of planning systems. They can be almost as close enough, so that the federal and the state and the local people have similar systems, similar type of plans, so they can quickly work together and coordinate in a large disaster. And in Japan, I'm sorry to say, but it's just not there. I've been interviewing a lot of people, and when I go to the field or talk to people in different services, what I'm hearing about is all sorts of dedicated people out there working night and day, and dedicated people here in Tokyo working night and day. But it's not a coordinated system. So you've got 10 different medical groups out here, and there's no connections between them. I talked to one doctor who said he had a problem because there are a lot of people who had inhalation problems. This water was filthy. This water coming from the tsunami, it wasn't clean water. It wasn't like, one of these water bottles. This stuff is full of oil and chemicals and all kinds of hazardous gunk. And people are getting sick from inhaling this stuff. And this one doc I talked to up in, I think it was up in Miyagi Prefecture, is trying to get through the health ministry to deal with this. And he's told, yeah, but look, if it's a medical problem, this office here handles it. But if it's a public health problem, this office handles it. But wait, if it's environmental health, this office handles it. And there was no connection between these offices. And this guy, who's sitting down here with probably a little cell phone that's running down quickly on its charge up there in Miyagi, is trying to get these different people to get together to get him some help, and he can't get it because there's no central point to go through. There's no real coordination. So I just don't think they have the coordinating ability in the government. Part of the reason for that is this 2-year rotation business where they don't really have much expertise in the national government here for disaster preparedness. They really don't. Those people are there on 2-year details, then they split and go someplace else. I worked at FEMA 28 years. Somebody there 2 years is still like the new staff person or a trainee almost. And that wasn't that unusual, but here they just don't have that kind of expertise. If I want to find long-time expertise in Japan for disasters, I look in 4 groups. I look in the self-defense force, I look in the fire service, I look in the health and medical communities, and more recently I look in the really growing sector of the nonprofits who are the volunteer groups who are really getting into this stuff big time in the last few years. But as I said to somebody earlier, I spoke with a deputy fire chief in a Japanese city recently, a Japanese gentleman, and I asked him, I said, by the way, how long have you worked in fire service? This guy says 30 years. This guy has been to 2 major, he went to Kobe and he went to Tohoku. He's been to 2 major disasters. And God knows how many oil spills, chemical spills, major fires, car wrecks, everything else. This guy has experience and judgment. He can get in there and do the job. He can manage people in the big incident. You try to go to the Japan government and find anybody who's worked in disasters for 3 years, and you're going to have a hard time finding them. When I looked at their organization chart at the cabinet secretariat, one of the little bubbles said expert committee, and I was drawn to that right away. This is great. Who are the expert committee? And the guy was kind of embarrassed and said, well, actually they're just high-ranking political officials. Well, they might be good. They might be great guys, very smart, good at winning elections, but they are not an expert committee of disaster specialists. They don't have expert committees in Japan, and it really pains me because I like Japan. I've got lots of friends here. I love coming here, and there's plenty of expertise in Japan, plenty of expertise they could draw on, and they just aren't really drawing on it in the government, and that's frustrating to me. So what I'm seeing lately is a lot of the NGOs here, a lot of fire services for that matter, a lot of groups are saying, never mind the government, we'll just make our own plans. That's good as far as it goes. And I can't say don't because nothing else is going to happen. But if, I was saying before to Kyle, if one prefecture has wonderful leadership, and if that prefecture works out a really great disaster management system, that's fine as long as it just happens within the prefecture. But if they've got to send people someplace else, or another prefecture has to send people there, the same problems are going to crawl over again. So that's my little splurge on the news from Lake Wobegon. So as far as the stuff goes, it was a terrible disaster last year. I understand it very well. I went up to Tohoku once last summer. There's me standing next to some car that was still sadly turned upside down. It was a terrible thing. But I also know that I was so impressed by the people I met, like these fellows here, in whichever town we visited, who are working so hard and worked so hard night and day to try to pull their communities back together. The will is there, the determination is there, and I really think that Japan can do it if they put their minds to it, and I sure hope they do. So there's my little spiel. Thank you all for listening.
You can wait for the microphone to pass.
They're intimidated by my officious nature.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk tonight. I have had this question, or been discussing this issue of coordination since the first interagency meeting I went to on March 19th of last year. And I've been struggling with still, actually it's now 11 months, why we can't get it together. And some people at this meeting, there was Ministry of Foreign Affairs was there, and then this new office that was set up for volunteer coordination, which has no political power, as you probably know. And people are saying, after the meeting, in the Nijikai post-meeting, people were saying that it was really a political issue. That's why no one could take the leadership. Now, I could get it on that day, but I actually don't get it this many months out. Why the coordination is still such an issue, because actually every month we had the same talk. I stopped going to the meetings in August, but I really don't understand why the coordination is still an issue. That's one thing. But I also wanted to ask you a completely different question. So I'll let you get out your pen and
Go.
The role of philanthropy. I downloaded an article from the Stanford Innovative something review about the role of philanthropy in promoting disaster preparedness, and how it's a really under-focused upon area that foundations, donor agencies should really put more focus on advocacy, so that at the local level, I work for a foundation, so that we actually do support community groups putting this together. And I wanted to know your opinion on this, that there isn't enough funding and it's not going to come from the government, and I just wanted your opinion on this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Two really good points. The thing of coordination is partly technical and it's partly political, because if you're going to have coordination, everybody's got to agree that there's going to be a coordinator. And the Japan government folks will tell me they coordinate. They aren't, because coordinating means you have this big discussion, you all discuss, you bring the points up and go back and forth. But at the end, at some point, there's this decision made, and some person or whoever the head person is says, okay, here's what we're going to do. You're assigned to this, you're assigned to this, you're assigned to this. We're all going to meet again in 3 hours or 3 days or whatever the time would be. And that is a political decision to invest that kind of authority in one particular office. Now, at FEMA, the head of FEMA has that authority in a disaster, but that authority stems from the president. So it's not that FEMA runs America, it's that the president is in charge of the U.S. government, and the president is essentially saying, look, I know how to win elections and do whatever else like this. I'm not a disaster specialist, so I'm appointing this person here, and he or she speaks for me in the disaster. When there's no disaster, FEMA's just another little agency, and if we call somebody else for a meeting, they might say, hey, we're busy come back next week or something. But in the disaster, the head of FEMA or his appointee speaks for the president. And so that is a political type issue. But linked to it, the technical type issue, okay, under Bill Clinton, We had James Lee Witt was the head of FEMA. The guy had spent, I don't know how many years in doing disaster management, and private company repairing bridges, and then the state of Arkansas, and then federal. The guy knew what he was doing. Under Barack Obama, we have Craig Fugate. Craig Fugate started as the head of FEMA. Craig Fugate was a paramedic in Florida. He worked his way up. He worked his way up. After X many years, he became the state disaster director in Florida for 5 or 10 years anyway, running evacuations after hurricanes and things. Then he became the head of FEMA. So coupled with that authority, there really has to be the technical know-how that not just this person is wearing the big badge, but that they really know what they're talking about, and people have to respect that. And those are the two pieces that that Japan would have to put in place if they wanted to do something like that. And it is both a political and a technical decision, and I'm not an expert on Japan politics, so.
Well, it's just curious to me that they put someone who'd been working in the homeless rights movement in that office to coordinate volunteers in Tohoku who had no experience in disasters or politics.
Oh, that sounds like it was you know, in the disaster, once this stuff happens, people want to put on a show and try to look good. And we've had the same problems with FEMA. Under both Bushes, we had really incompetent leadership, and it was terrible, where they'd be sending people out to disasters. I mean, I went to one, I was deployed down to Florida in 2004, and it was right before the election. And so they sent everybody in the world down to Florida after the hurricanes there. And we were told, if you haven't got an assignment yet, put on your FEMA hat and a jacket and get a car and start driving around so people can see FEMA's here. And I kind of raised my hand up and I said, after a disaster, the traffic lights are out, the National Guard people are trying to direct traffic, people are backed up for 2 miles trying to get to Home Depot to fix their roofs. Do you really want us to add to the traffic jam? Okay, never mind, don't do that. So you have a lot of dumb stuff going on. And at disaster time, it's going to be the time for the PR. You're stuck with that. But my question to him now is saying, okay, if something else happens a year or 2 or 5 years from now, what kind of planning are you doing now? Philanthropy, I agree with you. I think it's great to have more nonprofits involved. Private companies can get involved and do something. A lot of private companies want to do good things in disasters too. They need to be brought together. The thing they keep, I don't know, I mean, I'm a former federal employee, so I don't have too much of a bias here, but at some point they're just going to run into this problem that says, okay, if this is just voluntary, well, some people are going to go along and some people won't. Philanthropy can only go so far. I mean, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and these guys can give zillions of dollars out. But then how is that going to affect the actual policy? How is that going to affect what happens when the government sends out troops or doctors or something like this? Unless they want to say they're going to take over completely from the government, in which case I got to say, then why are we paying all those taxes to pay those people to sit in the offices over there? And I sound like a Tea Party person or something. Which I don't want to do that. I think that philanthropy has an important role in this, and the foundations do have a role, particularly in pushing for trying to do things right. That's something that philanthropy can really do, maybe funding some more studies, funding articles to get published. I don't know, you feel like sometimes you're hitting your head against a wall, but then things can turn around and the wall breaks down, so keep at it.
I just want to follow up on one of the comments you made on the NPOs. One of the things that a lot of people who are involved in the NPOs here, both in Kobe and now on a whole different scale in Tohoku, is the effectiveness that they have shown during this crisis. In your 6 weeks here, you've talked to a lot of Japanese officials. How do they see the contribution of NPOs? Is this just something that's nice and they appreciate it, but it doesn't point to any systemic failures, or is it something that they see as a resource that they could use and appropriate? Or I mean, I'm just wondering how one side looks at the other, because as you said, the NPOs look at even the state government kind of going, there's not much we can do with them a lot of times.
Yeah, honestly speaking, in the briefings and meetings I've had with the government people here in Japan, that topic never even came up. And I don't have any impression at all that they are even conscious of the NPOs being out there, other than these annoying people that are kind of getting in the way of the plan. And I think that's a huge, huge, huge mistake. If there is no plan ahead of time for almost anything to use the volunteers, then yes, it is tough, because you don't know which people are the crazies and which ones are the legitimate people coming in. And you don't want somebody coming in from a disaster area and then saying, wait, you mean I was supposed to bring my own water bottle? You know, you can't have that kind of thing going on. What they did, again, I don't want to glorify FEMA too much. You know, I retired out of there because it got so bad under Bush. But we had, some of the things we have, there's an office in FEMA of volunteer agency coordination. My friend Ben Curran works there. His job, full-time, Monday through Friday, is to coordinate and meet and talk with major nonprofit groups in the U.S. who are interested in doing things in disasters. And if they are, he lays down the rules for them. He gives them all kinds of guidance and training, access to information. He gets them categorized. Okay, your group. And these different NPOs like to do two different things. Some group says we specialize in house repair. It's the Amish or somebody, I forget which one. One will go in and repair houses. Another one will bring up food. Another one will do something else. They get this set up ahead of time. So when the disaster comes, if one of these groups calls FEMA, fine, we'll put them through the VOLAG desk. The VOLAG gets the volunteer agencies desk. We have a volunteer agencies desk at FEMA during the disaster. And this guy says, it might be Ben or one of his colleagues, okay, such and such group, yeah, you guys do so and so. Okay, how many people? Fine, go tomorrow, go to this town, report to this person. Here's their cell phone number. And we can use those people. We can channel them into the system. I've had my share of Red Cross sandwiches, believe me. We can channel them in. We can use these people. In Japan, I haven't seen any indication at all that the government has any plan or even understands that they could be using NGOs or NPOs ahead of time. And the NGO or NPO people I've talked to have said there isn't one. So to me, that is a horrendous waste of resources. To have one village over here saying, you know, we're starving, we haven't got any food or anything, and have people here saying, God, we got all these volunteers and truckfuls of food, but they won't let us take it up because we're not registered or something like this. It's a terrible waste. Sir?
On this NGO issue, I'm talking at this moment a little bit my experience, what happened in Aceh during the first tsunami. And there the functioning of the NGOs was a complete disaster. It was a fight for funding, what they were after, not so much helping the people, but their raison d'être, to be in that area, was more important for them than actually what they were doing. And what do we have to say, the sustainability of what they have been doing was very disappointing in the assessments that were made by the World Bank and other major donors that operated at that time in Aceh.
Yeah, that was in Banda Aceh?
In Banda Aceh, yeah.
And these were coming from different countries?
Yeah. It was mainly coordinated by the World Bank and IMF, but Australians were in it, Americans were in it, Europeans were in it, Japanese were in it, all the major donors were in it, and everything that went directly outside that system to the NGOs ended up as partly a failure.
Yeah, I understand. I don't disagree with that at all. You cannot just say, open the floodgates and let everybody who wants to volunteer come running in, because you can have cacophony. You can have back during the 70s and 80s when there'd be these disasters in Latin America, companies would donate crate loads of expired medications. The stuff was no good. It could kill somebody, but they get a tax write-off by donating it. People would send fur coats down to South America where it's about 100 degrees out there because they get a tax write-off. So the stuff has to be controlled. Now, internationally, I'm all for international cooperation, but having seen how almost impossible it is to get the system working inside one country, I'm not real optimistic about international cooperation. I mean, I have not yet talked with all the search and rescue people, but the U.S. was sending search and rescue teams over here to Japan at a time when, I'm going to go on a limb here, I haven't talked to them yet, but I have not yet heard of those American search teams actually making any live rescues. I think they probably got here too late to have done that kind of thing. At the same time, I was trying to send a plane load of food and water and clothes and boots over, but that wasn't going to go. Now, where was that decision made? It probably wasn't actually a decision that was made. It was like who got there first and which was going to look good. And search and rescue teams look a lot better on TV than just a bunch of boxes of food. So it's tough to do, and the international coordination of volunteers, I would be really getting into that, especially if you're going into a country that is underdeveloped. If you're coming into a country like Japan, that's a first world country with a government and everything, that's one thing. Going into some third world place or an underdeveloped place is a whole other kettle of fish. So all I'm really talking about here is within one country, even ignoring foreign contributions completely. I'm talking about, let's say, within Japan, where they have jurisdiction. You've got a government that can actually order and do things, and people that speak the same language and everything, and can be somewhat regulated. That can be done. I think it can be done. I think it's done reasonably well in the U.S. But that's strictly speaking, that's just within that country. The other stuff, that's the whole other mess. You're right. Thank you. Question up here?
I'm wondering to what extent the disaster of last March has raised awareness of the possibilities of there being such a disaster elsewhere in Japan as well as elsewhere in the world. Particularly a major tsunami, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, it should have been clear, at least a lot of seismologists think it should be clear that that scale of tsunami can happen anywhere around the Pacific Rim. And after last year, it should be even more clear that it can happen anywhere around the Pacific Rim. It could happen off the coast of Chiba Prefecture, which would be a lot more difficult to handle than Tohoku. It could happen off the coast of the Pacific Northwest with the, there's the so-called Cascadia quake. What has happened with awareness? Is it up? Sideways? Is it getting the attention it deserves?
There's a multiple question deserving multiple answers. Yes, the attention's up, and I've seen this. I think the parallel in the U.S. in a way was back in the 1980s. Back then at FEMA, I was working there, and the big thing everybody was planning for was the big Soviet nuclear attack. And back then, the U.S. had not had major disasters for a long time. And if you tried to say, well, what about getting ready for a big natural disaster? Well, those things don't happen in the U.S. They happen often in those other little countries someplace. Then here came Hurricane Hugo, Hurricane Andrew. Yeah, the awareness got raised. And fortunately for us, it got raised 3 months before the presidential election. And that's when Bill Clinton got in, and it was fresh in the memory, and they made some changes. In Japan, the awareness has certainly been raised, but the way of going at the problem is not the way I would recommend. I don't want to get too pushy here. I think that Japan, I've heard they've created a whole new ministry or a whole new office and given it a budget, but from what I've read, that is for the item number 1 out of those 4, the prevention. Better seawalls, better prevention against water. That's great as far as it goes, but what about response planning? Well, response planning, what I'm being told is they're still categorizing it by disaster here. So they're being told in Japan, okay, make a better tsunami response plan. Well, that's good, except 15 years ago, there was a big quake in Kobe, and they were told, make a better earthquake response plan. So everybody worked on an earthquake response like Kobe, but instead they got a tsunami. So maybe the next 5 years, they work on a tsunami plan, and instead the North Koreans lob a missile over or something like that. I really, just based on my experience, I think they would be way better off getting into a more generalized disaster planning mode and feeding that down to the levels of prefectures and of localities to really have some good training on what to do and not just write a bunch of new laws and regulations. So the awareness is up. What the government's doing, I don't put a lot of stock in, but I am very impressed by what I see. Honestly speaking, the NPOs, the voluntary groups are getting their act together, and they're just having to, they can't wait for the government, and they're not going to. The self-defense force, I mean, they're part of the government, I suppose, but the self-defense force has some pretty good plans and some good people there. The fire services certainly have their act together, and the health and medical people do within their genres or specialties. They're doing some good planning too. But these groups working together completely, I mean, they want to work. They're not that they're opposed to working together, but who's authorized to call a meeting and who's authorized to start to say, here's our new system and here's how it's going to work. That still isn't being done, as far as I can see. How about a cheerful question? I got a cheerful question over here.
I'm afraid this is not too cheerful.
Oh, come on. Cheerful question of a bunch.
You can make it cheerful by giving us a nice answer.
Oh, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Don't worry.
They predict a big earthquake in Tokyo within the next 4 years.
So I fly home Thursday.
Have you heard if anything is being done to prepare for this big earthquake?
I haven't looked at Tokyo metropolitan government at all. They're probably doing some good preparedness for it. I'm not saying that they're not doing anything, And in Tokyo, even down like at the ward level, they're doing some pretty good community organizing, community preparedness. People aren't sitting there, they're getting out doing things. But I guess the part that I happen to be familiar with because of my own personal career is sort of this overall overhead comprehensive planning and the coordination at the large scale among these different groups to get them to work together quickly and prioritize. And that, I still just don't see it being done. I don't see the prioritization is important, and that gets, I'll pick on my search, and I used to work in the search and rescue office at FEMA, but I'd be interested to know really, why was it a priority for a search and rescue team to come here and not plane loads of food and supplies to come here? Now, if somebody really made that decision, that's one thing, but I kind of question that. You know, was that priority really made? And the second part I still see happening is the complete disregard of the nonprofits and the non-governmental organizations here who really have, I mean, these are not amateur crazies or just fund grabbers or something. These are people who want to do the job and have some expertise and have shown they can do the job. And they're pretty much being left out, at least on the national level. Tokyo, the city itself, I haven't looked at them, so I couldn't tell you. So we'll say they're doing a good job. There's a cheerful answer. Yeah, another one. Got one didn't satisfy me. So
Another non.
yeah, usually I never get two questions from the same person. This is great.
No, I just remembered that we worry about the building collapsing or toppling, but I heard that even if the building just tilts a little bit, you can't live in it anymore.
That would be an architectural and engineering question. I think they did repair the buildings in Kobe. A lot of those buildings were leaning over after the quake. I think they repaired them. I'm not really sure how that works. I think, yeah, it did. I've seen, because I've been in some of the luxury hotels there and walked down this walkway and some of this big cement seam that's kind of crooked going down the middle. So they can, to a degree, repair those things, I think. If the original construction is strong, yeah, I think they can repair them.
That's a cheerful answer. Thank
There you go. See, I knew we'd get to it.
Cheerful question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who's next? You come in. You're from Oregon. Pick somebody here.
Do you think we can directly getting something lesson one from the damaged area? My awareness issue is that first of all, they are in the recovery period. They are focusing on the revival. Then they are not ready to share their experience to the experience nationwide. Secondly, we have the sense of taboo to say bad thing about the damaged area. Thinking they are victims, not to think over whether their plan was good or bad or something like that. We have that we are getting the good.
Well, I think that what you're getting into here, the question regards just the cultural issues in Japan, the cultural conditions. One person from an NPO said they'd go to a village and ask a person, "Did you get enough to eat today?" "Oh, yes, I had enough to eat." "Well, when exactly did you eat?" "Oh, actually, I guess it was yesterday." "And what did you eat?" "Oh, it was a glass of water and a little rice." "No, you haven't had enough to eat." There are cultural taboos here and cultural issues. That's why I really want to see here. I'm not telling the Japan government they should just Xerox the American plan and translate it into kanji. That's not going to work. But within the Japan culture and within what can be done, it seems to me there's a lot more that could be. Simply because I'm running into a lot. The people I'm talking with who are filling my notebooks with their interviews, these are not Americans. Maybe one or two Americans in there, but by and large, overwhelmingly, these are Japanese people who understand that the system isn't working well and want to see it improved and want to help improve it. So I have hope. This is not, generations change quickly. When I was here 12 years ago, a lot of Japanese civilians were not comfortable with the self-defense force coming in to help. Now I asked a doc up in Iwate, a young doctor, how he felt about it. He said, they were great, they did a nice job. Culture can change and culture can move. It does in the U.S. too. But I think within the Japanese culture, I think there is room for a lot of improvement, drawing on the Japanese expertise that's already here.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I'm just going to
maybe follow up on the NGO comments, and it's sort of a good but not so good comment about the way the government views NGOs. There's a discussion forum with Canadian and Japanese officials who responded in Japan and Haiti. They're doing a comparison. And the Japanese officials, on the one hand, they're struck by the novelty of NGOs being involved. So the way they spoke was extremely naive about these groups, but at the same time, the naivety was very positive. And the government, they said, this is great what these people are doing. But then what marked it as being naive was when they said, these NGOs should really coordinate themselves. They could do so much better. And then, so I raised the comment, I said, well, NGOs don't do that. That's the government. Is the only person who has authority to coordinate NGOs. And they said, oh, okay. And they really weren't aware of just the protocols, even basic protocols for the role of civil society in a disaster. But anyways, so they're quite positive about NGOs at the end of the day, is what I got from this discussion. But from today, most of the discussion today has been on the national level, but the topic was actually local level. So I wonder if you could maybe reflect on your experiences at interviews and your friends and associates. What are, for example, some of the low-hanging fruit that they could easily pick at the local level to improve their preparedness and response?
Well, I think that's a good point. I think, and I know I try to make this a local issue, kind of a lecture, but in fact, the type of planning considerations really are pretty much the same across the board. I think that local people, a local municipality here in Japan, if they decided to do it, could certainly pick up on some of these ideas here. They could say, well, here's a good way to make a plan. Let's make a nice all hazards plan for our community. And they could follow that little quickie map that I gave here today really was from a 300-page guidebook that is written in very plain English. It's not a lot of jargon that goes through and says, look, here's how we think from our experience is a good way to do it. But the problem they're going to run into is one local official, a Japanese official, came to me after the lecture and said, you know, this is all great, but we've been ordered by the government to make a tsunami plan. Well, then what are you going to do? I mean, I think they could follow this format. This format has been followed by a lot of U.S. cities. There's other U.S. cities that have done good formats as well. But I just don't see that happening. And it's not, you're back to the government thing. It's fine to say the city can do this or the NGOs can do that, but at some point, that wall's going to come in the way. Where's the authority? Where's the authority to do this? If all these NGOs want to coordinate among themselves, and they show up at City Hall in the stricken area and want to help out, and the City Hall guy says, wait a minute, you're not on the list we got from the government. You can't unload that stuff here. Well, what is this stuff anyway? You're running the same problem. So I think the local people could pick up on this, is all I can really say. They can pick up on this and do better planning, but they're still going to have the problem if the national government won't let them of what they're going to do, and I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, it's for them, the naivety of the people. I'm not sure, which ministry were you in? Was it the cabinet or?
There was actually the SDF, the Self-Defense Force.
Okay.
They're in charge of that.
Well, the SDF are good people too. They're some of the more practical people I've seen. I'm not sure if they understand, though, the issues like that you're raising up, because remember in the SDF, the military, you've got, as far as they're concerned, a controlled environment within that military pretty well. But they can say, okay, fine, let's have that group start doing that. The colonel will send the order tomorrow and they'll start doing it. Well, this falls outside the range of the SDF. And the NGOs can't just march off and do this stuff on their own because they got to have the civil authorities to okay it. And there's nobody in the civil authorities that I can find to okay it. A chicken and egg problem.
Thanks. I would have a question and a remark. My question is that you experienced both Kobe and Tohoku, which were historically very close to each other. And according to your experience, how much does the Japanese government or local authorities learn from Kobe? How different was the response and the preparedness on the disaster? I know they learned a lot on the mitigation part at first, with the building standards, but how much they learned on the response and the preparedness part. And That's my question. My remark is that I work for an embassy here, and for us it's emergency situations. For us, we see it from different aspects. For us, it's mainly we have to take care of our nationals and to get there out of the disaster area or help them get out of the country and so on, or find them. And after March 11, we have been talking a lot on being better prepared. And but during these talks, we did, before March 11, there was the flight disruption because of the volcano, and before that there was a bird flu, and before that there was something else. So one of the main conclusions that we had drawn was that the next disaster or emergency situation will be something completely different than we had before, so we will not be prepared. But but that kind of corroborates your conclusion that Japanese government or local government shouldn't be making tsunami plans, because there's also this fear or the mistake there that people here in Japan, not just Japanese, but embassies, they are thinking with their minds set on March 11 and preparing something like that. Similar thing will happen.
Okay, I think the questions are already interrelated here. First off, regarding what they learned from Kobe, and here's a little more positive stuff. They did a lot of things better this time than at Kobe. At Kobe, the national government was very slow to respond and very slow to even understand that they had a responsibility to respond. As I recall, and I was not in Japan at that time, as I recall, they said, gee, that's a shame. I hope those folks at Kobe do okay. Those are their first response to this, because that's something that happens someplace else, like a car wreck or something. So they did respond and get themselves together a lot more quickly. And they did get the self-defense force out there a lot more quickly and in real force. I was over at Ichigaya last week, and they had something, cumulatively, it was something like 50%, some huge portion of the self-defense force wound up going out there and being deployed. And I think that's great, because I know culturally in Japan that has been a big issue, and I'm glad they are working it through maybe, and they used the self-defense force well and got them out there. And they used medical teams and other resources. They used them, and they used them quickly. But the problem, and that I still kind of keep falling back on, is after the Kobe quake, they planned for another Kobe quake. And the planning does get specific. There are different things that doctors do after an earthquake versus what doctors do after a tsunami. So they planned for a quake, and they got a tsunami. Now they're going to plan for a tsunami. Well, maybe the next time it'll be something different again. And they'll say, gee, we couldn't have foreseen that. So I know the all-hazard thing sounds like a tough pill to swallow at first, but if you look at some of these documents and how it's done, we've worked that way. That's how we've worked it in the States, where we put the hazard-specific stuff gets down into the particular professions, the medical people or the search and rescue people, whatever. They tweak their systems for those different types of disasters. But the overall plan is for a disaster. So if something terrible happens, you can activate quickly, because sometimes those first minutes and hours are time you don't want to spend saying, now wait, was that an accidental collapse, or was it an earthquake, or was it a terrorist bomb, or what? Because that can delay you. So you want the general plan. As far as the embassy goes, I'm not a specialist at all in facility planning for a small group like that. But if you look at some of this stuff, or look on the FEMA website, you might find some things in there. But deciding the same principles would still apply. How do you activate quickly? What are the kinds of things you might have to do for your staff? And how would you plan to try to do those quickly ahead of time? And then start thinking about the likeliest types of disasters and make the finer points within that. This gentleman back here said up what?
Thank you. I just had a question about, you may have heard after the earthquake last year that after the nuclear accident happened and whatnot, foreigners in Japan were kind of freaking out and doing all kinds, like fleeing the country and whatnot. A lot of them because they couldn't understand what was going on around them, and they were just hearing rumors and whatnot. And I was just wondering if you're aware of any sort of best practices or things that you may have been exposed to in the U.S. in dealing with communities that don't speak the language. Like I live in a really international neighborhood here in Tokyo, and a lot of them don't speak any Japanese. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of anything that, one, that local people can do to prepare for disasters, but two, if you're just aware of any best practices for the people in that circumstance.
Not right offhand, but I'm sure it's done. We have the same situations in the U.S., Spanish-speaking communities, Vietnamese-speaking, and other groups as well. I know that we try to reach out to them and make announcements in different languages as much as possible. And there are certainly ways of doing it. One thing I suggested when I was here 10 years ago with the Tokyo government, there's lots of people who are living in Japan. I mean, I speak some basic Japanese, but I can't understand a rapidly spoken TV announcement or anything. I said, look, you've got the, not Yokosuka, is it Yokota Air Force Base? You get this big military, I think it's Yokota Air Force Base, that has a really powerful, used to be called Eagle FM, thank you, our fellow listener there. I used to listen to that all the time. I could go way out to the beach at Kasai Rinkai-Koen and get that station. They broadcast some popular music and news station in English. I said, if you had something you wanted to broadcast, you could link up with these guys. They could do broadcasting in English. They've got plenty of Spanish speakers in the military. They could do broadcast in Spanish. You could right there, between English and Spanish, probably catch a pretty good-sized chunk of the foreign visitors in Tokyo. And the response, of course, was, we're not sure we're authorized to talk to the U.S. military base about radio stations and things. So there's ways of doing it. You could Google around and find that kind of stuff. I'm sure it's out there.
Thank you. Have you studied technological disasters like there was the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, which was high technology, and a lot of experts didn't know what to do. Did you discover any lessons from that as to how people can decide what to do when they're faced with something that they've never come across before? And was that helpful? Would some of those lessons have been helpful for the Japanese response to Fukushima?
Well, two-part question there, I guess, or several parts. I'm not a technically smart person. My degree is in social work, so I don't know that much about oil spills, except like, don't put your foot in them, I guess. I think that there are a lot of lessons that have been learned technically, and that the technical response is sometimes difficult or sometimes impossible, and they do what they can. But I think for the kind of things I'm aware of, the more significant part is sort of the second part of your question. And there gets into an issue called risk communications. And if you Google that one, you'll find some really good books and some really good best practices on risk communications, which is just a fancy way of saying quit lying to people because it's not going to do you any good. And quit telling people nonsensical stories because it won't do you any good. In 2001, a fellow at a Florida newspaper died of anthrax suddenly. And we had to calm everybody down because the government had to calm people down because you don't want them to think it's a terrorist attack. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services went on TV and explained this fellow would like to go hiking and camping, and he probably drank some bad water and got some anthrax that way. The problem was that what he actually had was called inhalation anthrax. You don't inhale water. And the reporters talked to some doctors who said, that's ridiculous, that's impossible, it didn't happen that way. So of course the guy had tried to prevent panic, tell people a story, like they did at Fukushima, I guess. If you try to tell people a story to prevent panic, you're just going to make it worse. So that's one. To the second part of your question I can kind of get to is have qualified people that know what they're talking about make the announcements. Be careful what they say, look at it carefully that you know what you're saying, and put it in clear language people understand. But then in the end, don't try to lie to people. Give them the straight information. Otherwise, in very short order, they'll find out you're lying to them, and then they won't believe anything else to tell them, which makes your whole response a lot harder. Question? This is great, by the way. I like all these questions.
And thank you for your lecture. Actually, I was in the one local government in the Miyagi Prefecture for this week, and I was talking with the local government because I'm working for one professor who is now trying to revise the local government, the planning and preparedness for the disaster. And I asked about regarding the NGO and NPOs, and they said after the March 11th, they had a lot of offers from the NPO, what we can do. But what they said is they didn't have time or they didn't have people who can deal with such offers, because most of the people went to the evacuation area to deal with the people. Some people went to some area which have a problem, and there was the scarcity of people inside the local government at that time and after the disaster. But after all, they found out the importance of the coordination with the NPO or maybe other prefecture or the Miyagi prefecture itself. But they said there was no good coordinator. So my question is, like, how can we make, or what is necessary for making the good coordinator within the local government?
Okay, well, you hit me there. That is really, yes, you thought of these two-parters. First of all, that was sort of a two-part question. Thank you. First of all, on the NPOs and the NGOs and the use of volunteers, I mean, these people are absolutely correct. If they did not have a plan ahead of time on how they're going to use these people, then, geez, it'd be a mess trying to do it during the disaster. That's like, you can't do that. You try to invent this system in the middle of a disaster is really difficult. So that kind of planning needs to be done ahead of time. But this comes back to the idea of the second part of who is the local disaster coordinator. And this is something that at some point, if it were to be done, that can't just be somebody who steps up and says, well, I'll volunteer to do that. This has to be an organized government effort. We have these in the U.S. now. We did not always have local government coordinators. FEMA was established back in '79 under pressure from state governors who wanted some single point to go to for disasters. And one of the good things FEMA did over the years was FEMA gave out money to states and to localities to help pay the salaries. They'd say, if you'll hire a coordinator, we'll pay this % of the salary for the first 2 years or something like this. And we'll give them free training, free guidance and books and so on. And at first it didn't work out that great, but little by little, we got people into those jobs who understood the system and had our training and knew what they were doing and could all work together. But that's like a 5 or a 10-year process to do that. And it takes, in my view, it takes an effort from the national government at some level to say, look, we're going to do this. Because if it's not from the government, then it's not official. And when the disaster comes, these people aren't going to be able to get in the door any more than the NPOs or the NGOs were. So I think it can be done. There's plenty of smart people in Japan who can do this job. But somebody has to say, let's hire them and let's do it. And that just hasn't been done yet. So, you decide. I can't.
Thank you very much for taking another question from me.
I have to leave at midnight, but
okay, well, okay, 8-part question. Okay. Actually, picking up on the last comment, I think that the Bosai Volunteer Centers, one of the key issues was that not only were they not ready to deal with NPOs, but volunteer management is really a person management issue. And if you're not trained to deal with people, and that was my sense of some of the problems that occurred, knowing how to deal with different types of people, corporate people, government people, nonprofits, NGOs. But I want to, on a positive note, I think that there's many Bosai, basically they're combing a lot of the Bosai volunteer coordinators. I think that it's that there's been a new opportunity opened to open this dialogue, but I want to see if there's any other opportunities you see that coming out of this, because I believe that with every big challenge, every disaster, there's new opportunities to bring about positive change. And I think this one example was that there's this new window for civil society to actually be much more directly engaged with local governments, not just in Tokyo, not just in cities, but in rural areas where they were just looked at as volunteer or community groups. But now there's a new opportunity. So what other opportunities did you find?
Well, that I have not seen other opportunities. I'm not aware of other ones. But what you're mentioning does sound good. And I know I said, gee, I want the national government to do this mostly. I just get frustrated that they're not doing what I think their job is. But lacking that, I'd say to the NGOs and the NPOs, go ahead and start putting that together. You're absolutely correct that, I've been involved with some nonprofit stuff in my private life back home. And yeah, managing volunteers and doing a volunteer organization, you can't just say to somebody like, hey, go tell that lady to quit crying. You have to have some kind of training here and some kind of planning, to do these things. And what I'm saying, though, is you're right that there is this rich vein. There is like the resources in Japan are just amazing. I'll say something about this volunteers. 10 years ago or 12 years ago, the given literature in Japan was Japanese people do not volunteer. There are no Japanese volunteers. And now you look and see what's happened, whether it's those people were wrong or whether times have changed, but we have a different situation now. A lot of Japanese people do want to volunteer and do want to get involved and do these things. I think there's a rich vein there, and if the national government doesn't sit around, I mean, if I were running an NGO, I would not be sitting there waiting to turn 100 years old until the government does something. I'd be getting out and getting some plans together and maybe sit down with some local governments and say, look, if such and such happens, we'll come in and do this, and let's meet with you and make sure we can do it okay. So that might happen. I don't know of other resources other than the volunteer groups themselves. I really suggest they get together. One group, I mentioned this to Angel and a few others, there's a group in the U.S. called NVOAD. NVOAD is National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. And that is an NGO itself with a small staff of maybe 3-4 people or something near Washington, D.C. And they've become an umbrella group that coordinates and brings all these groups together. Now, I don't know if Japan Platform, I've heard of them, I don't know if they do that or whatever. I think that one good thing would be for these different NGOs and NPOs, as the gentleman here said, they lack political power and there are limits to what they can do, but on the other hand, why wait forever for the government? Start getting together and making your own plans, and maybe that will help to bring about political pressure to make the things happen you want to see happen. That's all I can really say in that. I don't know much more about the volunteer agencies. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my question is more about the U.S. and FEMA's operation. Since 9/11, with most federal funding and resources being channeled towards the war on terror, Al-Qaeda, etc., how much has that hampered disaster response in the U.S. compared to, because all the funding's gone to other areas, and the fact that you need to coordinate so many federal and state agencies in America, does that make it a lot more difficult than doing so in, say, a European country where you only have a few federal agencies?
No, I think in answer to your first part, if you watched any television or read the papers following Hurricane Katrina, you can see what a mess that was. Yeah, I mean, the Bush administration, I don't know if they just hated America or what, but they managed to screw up their government pretty much everywhere, especially at FEMA. So they took away our budget, they took away our training, they put us under Homeland Security, which sucked away all of our money, and then during Hurricane Katrina, the people in charge were not FEMA, they were Homeland Security people who God knows where their specialties were. So that whole shift to this war on terror thing, I think did hurt our ability to respond pretty clearly. Because of just political factors and just the foolishness. I mean, under Bush, people were hired strictly for their political beliefs or for their friendly connections. I mean, that happens under the Democrats too, but usually they look for at least a little bit of skill. The Republicans didn't particularly care about skill. It was the political loyalty and the friendship connections. So they went down badly, and hopefully it's coming back now, though. I mean, the Obama administration's got a lot of other things on their plate besides FEMA, but I do think the FEMA director is much better than before, and gradually that agency is re-strengthened. As far as coordinating the number of agencies, the number of groups, would it be easier in Europe or easier someplace else? I'm not really sure if it would make that much of a difference, because if you look at the emergency support functions that we came out with, they're in the old federal response plan. Number 1, transportation. Number 2 is communications. Number 3, public works. Number 4, firefighting. I can't list them all off anymore. Those are the same things you're going to have to do in England or Germany or France or any place where you have a big flood or a big winter freeze or something. You're going to have to do some of those things. I really believe in that concept, just because I saw how badly things ran before and how they worked a whole lot better when you had that sort of a plan under strong leadership and under competent leadership. I mean, you have to have that in there too, of course. I think that type of system, that type of plan, could work other places, adapted to their particular government issues. But I don't see any big deal about the number of agencies and the number of states.
There is one word that got my attention a little bit in your presentation tonight. And that is the word function.
What?
Function.
Function.
Yeah, the functions, what you would have to do. Not looking at the functions, not at the service providers, as I would like to call it. in your presentation, this was what I would like to call at a macro level, more at a country level. How, my question to you is, I don't know if it is feasible for you to answer, how is it, would it be possible to take in a disaster planning at a micro level, commune, one office block, embassy, government agency, can you achieve a type of functional approach in that environment?
I think you could. I don't see why not. If you're talking now, there's some limit on size, so there's only like a little group of 2 people or something, not obviously. But if you're talking about a township or a city or a county or something, yeah, they're going to have the same issues. If they're trying to respond, if they have a disaster in that town or that county, they're going to be thinking, okay, where do we stand as far as transportation goes for moving things around? Who's going to be taking care of them? What kind of health and medical problems are we going to have here? And who can either deal with those problems or, I mean, if you've only got like one dock in your town, you're obviously limited on, 5,000 casualties or something. But who can be expert enough to assess that damage, figure out what is needed medically, what is needed food-wise, what is needed water-wise, et cetera, and these things, and communicate that in an organized, systematic way up to the state or up to the national level. And that makes a huge difference. Back during the pre-days before we had this, you'd have these disasters or things would take place, and boy, the battle cry always is, oh my God, send us everything you've got. What a horrible thing to say, because then they would get all kinds of junk. They had people and stuff coming in days later when the disaster was over with, blocking up their roads. I think the system can work at a smaller level. It gets changed a little bit at the levels when you get down to the county level or the town level, and you can see that in this guidebook or in some of the typical plans that are around. But the same general principle, I think, still can be followed. To first figure out what are the jobs we have to do, and either do the jobs, or if we can't do the job and have to ask the state or the national government for help, who's expert enough to assess that quickly and tell the people what we need, and not just send us everything you've got.
Yeah, that's a little bit what I'm pointing at. And you would look, for instance, in the medical area, where you would have the need for doctors working with lung doctors, working people inhaling dangerous substances. You would need for burning wounds, amputation, whatever type of specializations you might need in a disaster response. How, as a smaller organization, can you achieve access to that type of services in your planning?
I think that what you would do would be first look inside your organization to see, and I guess you'd have 2 questions, would be who can respond to that problem, or if it's going to be too big that you can't respond, who can clearly and in a technically proper way assess the damage so you can ask for the right kind of help. I'm not a doctor, for example, and if I see a bunch of injured people, I'm like, oh, I don't know, send medical stuff. I don't know, I can't say send this, and this. So even if the town is, or whatever, is overwhelmed by the scale of it, if there are people and some plans in place to say, how can you at least roughly and quickly assess what your needs are, prioritize the needs, which things do you need first, and then you know how to communicate that to the next level in a way they'll understand and they'll get it, and they'll agree to say, yes, we got it, we'll send you the stuff. That can be done, even down at that town level.
Time for maybe 2 more questions.
Yeah, since you were talking about the assessment, I would like to ask you about assessment, because the one peculiar thing about this disaster I realized is that it's such a broad area was damaged, like 500 kilometers of East Coast was damaged. So I see still the government is struggling with the assessment. The way they assessed the disaster initially was they were taking the macroeconomic approach, which is like, how many the houses were damaged. So that's a certain percentage of the total houses. So they apply the percentage to the damage of the infrastructure and everything, and they cannot still really assess the whole damage. So have you studied given the the broadness of this disaster, how do you effectively assess the damage of this kind of disaster?
I think there's several aspects to it. One would be you have to train and have people ahead of time who actually have some macro-type expertise in this field. And FEMA developed some of these teams, I know, back in the 90s. I'm not sure if they evolved or changed them more. They would call them rapid assessment teams, who would have a small team of people, very, very specialized, an epidemiologist, a housing or construction specialist, whatever. People who could go to an area and could basically look at it and had enough professional judgment to say, well, here's the situation you've got here. But you had to have really good specialists trained ahead of time to do that. The other part is by breaking this down into, if you talk about response, breaking it down into regions. Yes, it was a huge area, but now it was made up of prefectures, and it was made up of townships, and it was made up of something else. It was made up of wards. There's all these little lines in there, and if those things can be broken down and categorized, and if you have people in those areas who at least have some level of training, some level of knowing what they're doing, then you're not dealing with this huge, huge area. You're dealing with these prefectures and these towns and these counties and these wards. And that's the only way I know that it would be done. It's still going to be a mountain of work. I mean, none of these plans make this stuff easy. They just make it a little more organized.
Last question.
And afterwards, if we're out of the side, what time does JR quit running? Never. I'll be here for more questions. Big gentleman here.
Okay, this might be a cheerful question, maybe.
Oh, great.
So you've identified some shortcomings, not cheerful. You've got some recommendations to make. What's your plan for getting the people who matter to listen to you and to become change catalysts?
Boy, that's a good one. I thought you were going to tell me how I could do that. I don't know. I'm not a Japanese citizen. I don't have any power or authority over here. All I can do is bring in whatever expertise and knowledge I do, and I try to stay neutral or whatever objective as an outside observer. And all I can do is observe these things, and I go and give my lectures and write articles and give this information to Japanese people, and there seem to be a growing number of people and a growing number of professions that want to bring about change. But they're going to be the ones that have to fight that fight out. I can't. I don't have any way of doing it, and it probably wouldn't be proper for me to do that. But I'll do everything I can to present all the information I can, so the Japanese people who do think that their country needs a better system can take whatever information I can give them and use it to improve the system. That's cheerful.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it.